Buried beneath the rolling parkland of Sherwood Forest in North Nottinghamshire lies one of the most extraordinary secrets in English aristocratic history. An underground city excavated not for war, industry or survival, but for the privacy of one man. William John Cavendish Scott Bentinck, the 5th Duke of Portland, spent over 2 decades and millions of pounds creating a subterranean labyrinth of tunnels, ballrooms, libraries and chambers stretching for at least 15 miles beneath his estate at Welbeck Abbey. He built it so he could move, live and exist without ever being seen. The crown jewel was an underground ballroom measuring 158 feet long, 63 feet wide and 22 feet high, excavated entirely from solid clay, its ceiling pierced by domed skylights that admitted daylight without revealing the room's existence to anyone walking across the grass above. He never hosted a single guest at Welbeck Abbey, never held a dinner, never staged a dance, never received a family gathering, and the paintings from the Portland collection, works by Van Dyck, Holbein, Tintoretto, Reynolds and scores of other old masters, hung in gaslit silence 15 feet below the surface of the parkland, seen by no one but the Duke himself. He built the second largest indoor riding school in the world, 385 feet long and 112 feet wide, its thousands of gas jets illuminating an equestrian arena he never once rode in. He built hunting stables for 96 horses with floors of Minton's encaustic tile, the same ceramic laid at the Palace of Westminster. He built a poultry house, where his chickens roamed a grass yard enclosed by iron railings and planted with fruit trees, an ornamental fountain at the centre, and the whole structure executed with more architectural care and expense than most English farmyards had ever received or ever would. He built a kitchen garden of 22 acres, larger than Prince Albert's at Frogmore, with an underground water collection system and iron fruit arches 700 feet long. He built 50 estate lodges for his gardeners and keepers, all in Steatley stone to a common design, each with a subterranean kitchen excavated beside it and lit by thick glass panels set flush with the ground, because even the homes of his employees had to extend below the surface, and almost none of it was used after he died. Above this invisible world sat an abbey whose history stretched back 7 centuries, through Preman Stratton Shun cannons and Tudor horsemen, and Civil War silver buried in a brewery, and a duchess who tried to catalogue every living species on Earth, and the man who inherited all of it responded by digging a hole and climbing inside. Today we walk through the underground city a British duke built, so he would never have to be seen. Welbeck Abbey's story begins 7 centuries before the eccentric duke ever set foot in it, in the dense wild reaches of Sherwood Forest, during the reign of King Henry II. The estate was founded in approximately 1153 by Thomas de Cuckney, a local lord whose ancestor, Jos the Fleming, had held the Cuckney lands since the Norman conquest, and Thomas de Cuckney was described in the abbey's own register as vir bellicosus, a man of war, having built one of those private castles that so inflamed the chroniclers of King Stephen's turbulent reign. In an act of pious foundation, he gave his Cuckney lands to Berengar, the first abbot of Welbeck, and to the canons of the newly established house. The monastery he founded was established for the Prémon Stratton Shun order, a community of regular canons that had been founded in 1120 by Saint Norbert of Xanten at Prémontré in northern France, best known in England as the White Canons, for the simple undyed white woolen habits they wore, a deliberate contrast to the black of the Benedictines. The order reached England in the 1140s, its first English house at Newhouse in Lincolnshire, and Welbeck was among the very early foundations that followed. The canons built their church, dedicated to St. James the Apostle, on a level piece of ground beside a small brook named the Welbeck, which gave the entire estate its name. The site sits low in the landscape, sheltered and encircled by what would later become parkland, but was then the dense canopy of Sherwood Forest, a building site that had been deliberately chosen, as one historian noted, by religious men who asked retirement and shelter. It was an instinct for concealment that the abbey's most famous future owner would, 7 centuries later, carry to its logical extreme. The canons had sought retirement from the world behind monastery walls, and the fifth Duke would seek it beneath the earth itself. The abbey attracted considerable patronage over the following centuries, growing wealthier and more influential through gifts from the Gow, Schill, Danecourt, Bassett, and other Nottinghamshire families. A second major patron was John Hotham, Bishop of Ely, who in the 14th century acquired the entire manor of Cuckney and settled it upon the abbey, adding 8 new canons' stalls, a significant enlargement of the community. Edward I granted a royal subsidy, further cementing the house's status among the leading religious foundations of the English Midlands. By no means was the community's internal history entirely saintly. A visitation report from 1478 painted a dismal picture of a house in moral and physical decay. The canons apparently roaming the surrounding woods with bows and arrows, hunting for sport in the very Sherwood Forest their founder had retreated into for prayer, while the buildings themselves crumbled with neglect. And by 1482 the abbot himself stood accused of leasing out large portions of the monastery's lands for personal profit and pawning the precious plate and sacred utensils of the house. These were not isolated scandals, but symptoms of a broader malaise afflicting many English monasteries in the later medieval period, and the visitor who documented them, clearly, expected worse to be found beneath the surface. The house eventually recovered its standing and discipline, and by the time of Henry VIII's dissolution, Welbeck had risen to become the preeminent establishment of the White Canons in England, the chief house of the entire Premonstratensian order in the country. The irony is complete. It was precisely its standing that guaranteed it would be seized. On the 20th of June 1538, Richard Bentley, the 25th and last abbot of Welbeck, formally surrendered the house to the Crown. Over 380 years of monastic life ended with the stroke of a pen, and the irony of this ending was complete. It was precisely the abbey's standing as the chief Premonstratensian house in England that had guaranteed its seizure. The estate was granted by Henry VIII to Richard Whalley of Screveton, and although the physical church and cloister buildings were demolished, as was standard practice after the dissolution, significant medieval stonework survived in the basement levels of the structures that were built over them. 3 centuries later, during plumbing works in 1884, workmen would discover the skeletons of several abbots behind the basement walls, the Premonstratensian dead still lying where they had been interred beneath the floors of their own church, undisturbed by the Elizabethan mansion and the Georgian palace and the Victorian tunnels that had been built above and around them. From Whalley, the estate passed through a draper from the City of London before being purchased in 1599 by Gilbert Talbot, 7th Earl of Shrewsbury, for £555 6 shillings and 6 pence, and 8 years later he sold it to Sir Charles Cavendish, the youngest son of Bess of Hardwicke, one of the most formidable and wealthy women of Elizabethan England, whose ancestral home at Hardwicke Hall lay less than 10 miles away. The passion for building that Bess had so spectacularly expressed at Hardwicke, one of the most ambitious domestic building programmes of the Elizabethan era, was evidently inherited by her son, who immediately set about demolishing what remained of the medieval monastic fabric and commissioning a grand new country house in its place. His architect for this ambitious project was the great Robert Smith's son, the same man who had worked for Bess at Hardwicke and who had already produced some of the defining masterpieces of Elizabethan architecture in England. Only a portion of Smith's son's Welbeck design was realised in Sir Charles's lifetime, because he simultaneously commissioned Smith's son on the extraordinary Bolsover Castle, begun in 1608 and just 8 miles away, and the 2 projects competed for attention, resources, and the patron's purse. Sir Charles died in 1617, leaving both estates unfinished, but the foundations of what would become one of England's great country houses were laid, and Welbeck passed to his son William Cavendish, who would become the first Duke of Newcastle and one of the most dazzling courtiers of his era. William was, by all accounts, a supremely accomplished horseman, whose love of the equestrian art was unmatched in England, and he would later write one of the definitive treatises on the manège, the haute école horsemanship that was the supreme accomplishment of the European cavalier. He was also a generous patron of literature and science, an intimate of the Stuart court who corresponded with and patronised the philosophers Hobbes and Descartes, and he maintained a permanent household of musicians at Welbeck, whose performances entertained the court. In 1619, King James I visited Welbeck in state, and William received him with such magnificent hospitality, such lavish entertainment, such brilliance of table and stable and theatre, that the following year the king elevated William to the Viscountcy of Mansfield. In 1633, King Charles I journeyed north and was entertained at Welbeck with such extravagance that contemporaries reeled. For this occasion, William commissioned from his friend and protégé Ben Jonson the masque entitled Love's Welcome at Welbeck, and the entertainments reportedly cost between £4,000 and £5,000. The following year, the King and Queen Henrietta Marie returned, and Jonson produced a second masque, Love's Welcome at Bolsover, for the Bolsover leg of the visit, with the combined two entertainments costing their host a staggering £20,000. It was during this period that William built the first great riding house and stables, designed by Smithson's son John, establishing the equestrian tradition that would, 2 centuries later, produce the underground riding school of the 5th Duke. The Civil War shattered this gilded world entirely. William was made Royalist Captain General of the North of England in 1642 and raised troops entirely at his own expense, funding the king's cause from the same fortune that had paid for Ben Jonson's masques and Hobbes's philosophy. After the disastrous Royalist defeat at the Battle of Marston Moor in 1644, he fled to the continent, leaving Welbeck, which had been turned into a Royalist military garrison, in the hands of his 3 daughters, Jane, Elizabeth and Frances. Jane, the most resourceful of the 3 sisters, arranged for trusted soldiers to bury the family silver in 2 large barrels deep within the brewery, concealing the Bentinck fortune beneath the floor of the one building the parliamentary troops were least likely to search. The silver survived the occupation, the Commonwealth and the interregnum, and was waiting for William when he returned. When William finally returned home in 1660, after 16 years of exile on the continent, he found the house stripped bare by successive parliamentary occupations. No furniture or any necessary goods, only the paintings saved by his eldest daughter's resourcefulness, and the barrels of family silver that Jane had buried beneath the brewery floor, still waiting in its barrels beneath the floor. The cost of the Civil War to the Cavendish-Bentinck fortunes was catastrophic and permanent. William had spent, by his own accounting, £1 million in the royal cause, raising and equipping armies, fortifying garrisons, paying troops and maintaining the royalist command in the north of England, and none of it was ever fully restored to him by the crown he had served. He was eventually created Duke of Newcastle in 1665, a title that acknowledged the scale of his sacrifice even if the accompanying financial settlement did not, and he died at Welbeck in 1676, having spent, by his own accounting, £1 million in the royal cause, none of which was ever fully restored to him. What followed the first Duke was a sequence of female inheritors, each of whom married into new families and brought new names and new architectural visions to Welbeck. The Duke's granddaughter, Henrietta Cavendish, married Lord Edward Harley, son of Queen Anne's most powerful minister, Robert Harley, Earl of Oxford, and her husband was a compulsive and ruinously extravagant collector whose debts plagued them throughout their married life. Widowed at 47, Henrietta returned to Welbeck and devoted the remainder of her life to transforming it architecturally. Working with the architect John James, who had collaborated with Wren, Hawksmoor and Gibbs on some of the most significant projects of the English Baroque, she created some of the most ambitious domestic Gothic revival interiors in England, decades before the style became fashionable. Her Gothic revival apartments at Welbeck were an expression of personal aesthetic taste so advanced that the next generation of English architects would spend 50 years catching up with what a widowed countess had built in rural Nottinghamshire, out of grief and ambition, and an inheritance she refused to let her husband's creditors destroy. Her initials, HCHOM, can still be found embroidered into several places in the Abbey's fabric, a quiet claim of authorship over the transformation she achieved. Henrietta's daughter, Lady Margaret Cavendish Harley, then married William Bentinck, 2nd Duke of Portland, and it was through this marriage that the Welbeck estates passed definitively and permanently into the hands of the Dutch-origin Bentinck family. The Bentincks had arrived in England with William III during the Glorious Revolution of 1688, granted enormous estates in reward for their loyalty, and the marriage to Margaret Harley added the ancient Welbeck lands to a portfolio of property that already made the Portland Dukes among the largest landowners in England. Margaret was the richest woman in Britain of her time, and her fame rested not on her wealth alone, but on the astonishing Portland collection she assembled at her home at Bulstrode Park in Gloucestershire, a natural history collection of such scope that its curator was the Swedish botanist Daniel Solander, a student of Linnaeus, and its most celebrated single object was the famous Portland vase, now in the British Museum. Her ambition was nothing less than to catalogue and describe every living species on Earth, and her auction catalogue, after her death in 1785, recorded that it had been the Duchess's intention to have had every unknown species in the three kingdoms of nature described and published to the world. It was a project of staggering intellectual ambition, pursued with the resources of one of the largest private fortunes in England, and the collaboration of some of the finest scientific minds of the Georgian era. The collection contained 3,000 shells alone, curated by Solander himself, and the breadth of the holdings, from Pacific Island specimens brought back by Captain Cook's voyages to minerals, insects and botanical drawings of species that had never been classified, made Bulstrode Park one of the great intellectual destinations of 18th century England. Her son, the third Duke, who would go on to serve twice as Prime Minister and who had little interest in shells or botany, promptly sold the entire collection at auction after her death in 1785. The natural history shrine that Margaret had spent a lifetime building was dispersed in a single sale, the Portland vase passing eventually to the British Museum, where it remains one of the most famous objects in the collection, and the rest scattered across 100 private hands and lost to the family forever. The Dukes of Portland were among the most politically prominent grandees in 18th century Britain. The third Duke, William Henry Cavendish Bentinck, served twice as Prime Minister, first from April to December 1783 under the ill-fated Fox-North coalition, then again from 1807 to 1809 under a predominantly Tory ministry, despite insisting to the end that he was still a Whig. He rarely spoke in Parliament in either premiership, and his claim to the leadership was, as contemporaries bluntly observed, his rank and his mild disposition, rather than any brilliance of intellect. His tenure as Prime Minister was a study in aristocratic inertia, elevated to the highest office in the land, and the contrast between his passivity in government and the volcanic energy his grandson would bring to the construction of tunnels beneath the family estate could hardly be more complete. He died in October 1809, just weeks after an apoplectic seizure forced his resignation from office, and was succeeded by his son as fourth Duke, a quieter man who married a daughter of the colourfully described famous gambler, General John Scott, and settled into the management of his vast Nottinghamshire estates. It was this fourth Duke who fathered the future fifth Duke in 1800, and who thereby set in motion the chain of inheritance that would produce the most extraordinary building programme any English aristocrat had ever undertaken, executed entirely in secret, entirely underground, and entirely for the benefit of a man who wished, with an intensity that consumed decades and millions and the labour of 1,000 hands, to live as if he did not exist. By the time the fifth Duke inherited in 1854, Welbeck had accumulated nearly 700 years of layered history within its walls and beneath its lawns. Medieval stonework from the Preman Stratton Abbey survived in the cellars. Smithson's 17th century fabric formed the bones of the building. Henrietta's Gothic revival interiors glowed in the upper apartments, and the landscape park sprawled across 1,140 hectares with an 8-mile boundary and a great lake. The Portland collection was one of the finest in private hands. Van Dyck portraits, Michelangelo drawings, miniatures by Hilliard and Oliver, silver of museum quality, and a library of manuscripts and printed books that would have done credit to any university. The fourth Duke had begun vast Georgian improvements to the park, and grounds that would, under normal circumstances, have occupied a generation of further embellishment and maintenance. The landscape that greeted the 5th Duke's eye when he inherited in 1854 was one of the most beautiful in the English Midlands. Ancient oaks descended from the Sherwood Forest of legend, the Great Lake reflecting the Georgian facade, avenue drives stretching for miles through the 15,000-acre estate, and deer herds moving through the parkland in patterns that had not changed since the Premon-Stratton-Shun cannons first cleared the ground 7 centuries earlier. The estate had its own gasworks, its own farms, its own lodges, its own chapel, and an 8-mile boundary wall enclosing 1,140 hectares of the most carefully managed landscape in Nottinghamshire. Welbeck was, in every sense, a fully formed aristocratic world, ancient, layered, complete, and awaiting only a patron with the resources and the inclination to bring it to its fullest expression. What the new Duke was about to do to it would eclipse everything that had come before, not by improving or adding to the accumulated heritage above ground, but by turning inward, digging downward, and building an entirely new world beneath it, a world designed for one person and built by hundreds. The crown jewel of the 5th Duke's subterranean world was the underground ballroom, widely described as the largest private room in England at the time of its construction. Measuring approximately 158 feet long, 63 feet wide, and 22 feet high, it was excavated entirely from the solid Nottinghamshire clay that underlies the Welbeck estate, and it was sunk below ground level so completely that a person standing on the grass above the ballroom could feel nothing beneath their feet except earth. The room was larger than most public assembly halls in England, larger than many parish churches, and larger than several of the London clubs where the Duke's social equals gathered to dine and debate. And it existed in a place where no room had any reason to exist, sunk into the clay beneath a lawn that gave no sign of what lay beneath it. Its ceiling was pierced at regular intervals by domed, bull's-eye skylights, large rectangular panels of thick plate glass set at grade level in the lawn above, which admitted daylight into the space below without revealing any trace of the room's existence to anyone walking across the estate. The design was ingenious. From above, the skylights appeared to be nothing more than glass panels set into the grass. From below, they filled the room with a diffused, even light that made the space feel habitable rather than sepulchral. Contemporary accounts marvelled at its comfort. It was well lit, centrally heated, and not at all damp. The gas lighting system supplied from the Duke's own on-site gasworks, providing an even warm illumination that made the room feel less like a cellar than a drawing room of exceptional proportions. The skylights at grade level were designed to be walked over without notice. A visitor crossing the lawns of Welbeck could stand directly above a room of cathedral proportions and have no idea it existed beneath their feet. The construction of this room alone was an engineering feat of the first order. To create it, the Duke's workforce had to excavate enormous quantities of the dense Nottinghamshire clay by hand, removing hundreds of cartloads of earth and transporting them away from the site without disturbing the surface landscape. The entire structure was then bricked and arched from below, the vaulted ceiling constructed to bear the weight of the parkland above, and the surface was covered and landscaped to conceal any evidence of what lay beneath. The result was a room of cathedral proportions, warm, comfortable and entirely dry despite being sunk in clay, that could only be entered by descending below ground, a spatial inversion so complete that later visitors struggled to believe the space existed at all until they were standing inside it, looking up at the vaulted ceiling and the skylights through which the Nottinghamshire daylight filtered in silence. The extraordinary irony surrounding the ballroom is that it was almost certainly never used as a ballroom during the 5th Duke's lifetime. The Duke never hosted a single guest at Welbeck Abbey, never held a dinner party, never staged a dance, never received a visitor of any kind, and the name ballroom is a posthumous invention, applied by the 6th Duke's household to describe how the space was eventually used. The room's original conception, as recorded in surviving early estate plans, was considerably more contemplative in character. The first scheme identified it as a chapel, and then, in subsequent revisions, it appears to have been redesignated as a picture gallery, and indeed by the time the Duke died, it was hung with paintings from the Portland collection, including important works by Tintoretto, Teniers, Snyders, Barsanoe, Van Dyck, Holbein, Kneller, Lely, Reynolds, and scores of other old masters accumulated across generations of Bentinck collecting. The adjacent rooms, rather than being conceived as supper rooms, appear in the Duke's own plans as libraries, periodical rooms, and at least one space labelled simply as a museum. The entire underground complex, as originally planned, was less an entertainment suite than a private research institution. A chapel, a gallery, a museum, a library, and a reading room, all sunk beneath the earth, all lit by gas and daylight through the skylights, and all designed for a single occupant who wanted to study, to think, and to look at paintings without being observed doing so. The most evocative of the adjacent spaces was the bird room, a chamber lined floor-to-ceiling with glass display cases containing taxidermied birds, falcons, eagles, herons, and innumerable smaller species, one newspaper account claiming the collection contained specimens of every known bird except one. Historians have interpreted the bird room as a deliberate homage to the Duke's ancestor, Margaret Cavendish Harley, Duchess of Portland, whose vast natural history museum at Bulstrode Park had been one of the wonders of Georgian England before the third Duke sold the entire collection at auction in 1785. What the fifth Duke sought to reconstruct underground was, in a sense, the natural history shrine his family had lost above ground. The Duchess's ambition to catalogue every living species, dispersed by her own son at auction, was being reassembled in miniature beneath the soil of the same estate. The birds that once filled the chamber were later transferred to Wollerton Hall in Nottingham, where many survive to this day, the last physical remnant of the Duke's underground museum. The enfilade of grand rooms connected to the main hall was designed for a series of solitary intellectual purposes: reading, reflection, natural history, art. One can picture the Duke pacing the gas-lit galleries alone at night, surrounded by the finest paintings in England and cases of stuffed birds, 22 feet beneath the surface of the estate, encountering no one, the silence broken only by the hiss of the gas jets and whatever sound his footsteps made on the tiled floor of a room the size of a cathedral nave. The space's transformation into one of Edwardian England's most sensational party venues was entirely the work of the sixth Duke and his wife Winifred, who inherited Welbeck in 1879 and found themselves in possession of an underground complex that had been designed for solitude, and was now, with a few adjustments, capable of hosting the largest private parties in England. The practical logistics of getting guests into a room that existed entirely below ground were solved with a characteristic combination of engineering ingenuity and theatrical flair. On ball nights, guests arrived at the surface in their carriages, and a large hydraulic lift sunk into the ground, then lowered each carriage intact, still containing its passengers, to the underground level. From there, a gently graded inclined tunnel carried the carriages directly to the entrance of the ballroom, so that guests could step out at the threshold of the dance floor. The effect, by gaslight, must have been otherworldly. Descending in your carriage through the earth, the gas-lit brick tunnel walls passing on either side in a warm amber glow, and emerging in a room larger than most London ballrooms, 22 feet below the lawns of the estate, the music already audible through the stone, and the whole underground world blazing with gaslight. The supper rooms, the fifth Duke's contemplative libraries and periodical rooms, were pressed into service as dining spaces where 400 or more guests could be seated simultaneously. The sixth Duke used the underground complex to host balls, shoots and dinners that were among the most celebrated events in the Edwardian calendar, and the Prince of Wales attended on multiple occasions. The scale of the transformation was complete. Rooms built for silent contemplation were filled with the sound of orchestras, champagne corks, and the laughter of 400 of the most privileged people in England, all of it taking place 22 feet below the lawns of Sherwood Forest. The rooms that had been built for a man who never entertained a single soul became the setting for some of the most lavish, aristocratic gatherings of the age. The underground works represented only one dimension of a building programme that was, by any measure, one of the most ambitious, privately funded construction campaigns of the entire Victorian era, because above ground the fifth Duke constructed a series of structures that individually would have distinguished any aristocratic patron. The most extravagant surface creation was the new riding house, a structure of such extraordinary scale that it remains to this day the second largest indoor riding school in the world, surpassed in its own century only by a single imperial establishment in Moscow. It stands approximately 385 feet long, 112 feet wide, and 51 feet high, dimensions that place it in the category of major public buildings rather than private domestic structures. The riding arena enclosed more interior volume than many Victorian railway stations, and the comparison is not accidental, because the Duke brought the same engineering ambition to his equestrian architecture that his contemporaries were bringing to the construction of the great termini. The walls were constructed of dressed stone from 3 local quarries, Anston, Gypsy Hill, and Belf Moor. The external appearance is deceptively conventional. To a visitor approaching across the park, the building presents what appears to be a standard pitched tile roof. But the deception is almost too perfect, because concealed behind those visible tiles is a massive domed roof of iron and glass, invisible from the outside, that floods the riding arena below with natural light. This inner dome contained approximately 28,000 square feet of glazing and sat within a 3-division roof structure. The centre section, a massive circular dome of iron and glass. The 2 flanking sections of pitch pine with copper tiles. The engineering of this concealed dome was among the most sophisticated structural achievements of its era in domestic architecture. The fact that the entire apparatus was hidden behind conventional roofing tiles, visible to no one approaching from any direction, so that the largest private riding school in England presented itself to the world as an oversized barn, was entirely characteristic of a patron who spent millions creating magnificence and then concealed it from every eye but his own. On each of the 44 cast-iron columns lining the interior of the arena, the Duke had installed a circle of gas jets 3 feet 6 inches in diameter, each one festooned with cut-glass decoration that caught and multiplied the light, and a 2-inch gas pipe ran the full perimeter at 16 feet from the ground, adding further jets to the total. 7,500 gas lights in a single riding hall. Connecting to the equestrian complex by underground passage was the Tan Gallop, a 1,270-foot covered track, nearly a quarter of a mile long, laid with the tan bark chips traditional for exercising racehorses, the entire length roofed in glass so that the horses could be exercised in every season, regardless of the Nottinghamshire weather. The Bentinck racing interests had been celebrated for decades, and the family had reportedly accumulated winnings equivalent to £30 million in today's money. The equestrian tradition at Welbeck running in an unbroken line from the first Duke's riding house through the Tan Gallop to the great arena that the 5th Duke built and never used. Adjacent were the hunting stables, constructed to house 96 horses in individual stalls, each finished with Minton's encaustic tiles, the same decorative ceramic floor covering then being laid in the corridors of the Palace of Westminster. The Duke's horses lived in stalls tiled to the standard of the House of Commons, a detail that says everything about his priorities and nothing about his sanity. The Duke reportedly maintained around 100 horses at any one time across his various stables and paddocks, maintained by grooms and stable hands who were governed by the same rules as every other employee on the estate. The Duke was never to be looked at, never to be spoken to, and never to be acknowledged in any corridor, stable yard, or riding arena. He never once rode in it. The tunnels were the connective tissue of the 5th Duke's invisible world, the infrastructure that allowed the entire underground complex to function as a single sealed system through which a man could move from one end of the estate to the other without ever appearing above ground. The network stretched for at least 15 miles beneath the estate, connecting the abbey to the riding house, the equestrian hall to the stables to the kitchen garden to the lodges, and ultimately the estate itself to the railway station at Worksop, more than a mile and a half away. The tunnels were wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, gaslit throughout their length, and in the main arterial passages wide enough for a horse-drawn carriage to pass through at a trot. The construction of these tunnels required the same laborious excavation technique as the ballroom, cutting through dense Nottinghamshire clay by hand, bricking the walls and arching the ceilings from below, then sealing and landscaping the surface to eliminate any visible trace. The principal tunnel, connecting Welbeck to the railway station at Worksop, more than 1.5 miles away, was the Duke's primary means of leaving the estate without being observed by anyone. He would enter a carriage at the Abbey, be driven underground through the tunnel's full length, and emerge directly at the station platform, where a reserved railway carriage with frosted windows awaited. The frosted glass ensured that no fellow passenger, no station porter, no passing pedestrian on the Worksop platform could catch a glimpse of the Duke's face. His London residence, Harcourt House in Cavendish Square, was maintained in a state of permanent readiness for his arrival. The servants instructed to keep fires lit, meals prepared, and rooms heated, whether or not the Duke was expected. He could enter through a private entrance without passing through any public area of the building, and the household staff in London, as at Welbeck, had standing orders to make themselves invisible the moment they heard his approach. In London, as at Welbeck, his instructions to household staff were absolute and unvarying. No one was to look at him, no one was to speak to him unless spoken to, no one was to acknowledge his presence in any way, and any servant who encountered him in a corridor was to pass him as they would a tree. The instruction is so strange and so specific that it has become the most quoted detail of his life. But it was entirely consistent with the logic of a man who had spent millions of pounds ensuring that movement between 2 points could be accomplished without visual contact with another human being. His meals at Welbeck were prepared in the kitchens and delivered through a series of heated trolleys pushed along underground corridors to his private rooms, each dish covered and transported through the tunnel system, so that neither the cook who prepared the food nor the footman who transported it was ever in the same physical space as the man who ate it. The separation was total and systematic. The Duke's food passed through multiple pairs of hands before reaching his door, each transfer happening at a designated point in the tunnel system, but no hand that touched the plate ever belonged to a person who could see the Duke's face. The architecture of the tunnels had been designed, among other purposes, to make this kind of invisible service possible. A roast chicken was placed outside his door every day at the appointed hour, and the previous day's chicken, whether eaten or not, was removed by a servant who knocked, waited for the door to remain shut, and then exchanged the plates without entering. The Duke's appetite for chicken was prodigious and unchanging. The same meal, the same time, the same door, every day for decades. His preferred method of communication with his household was the letterbox. Instructions were written on slips of paper in the Duke's own hand and deposited in brass-fitted letterboxes installed at intervals throughout the house and tunnels, to be collected and acted upon by servants who had been trained never to seek clarification in person. And yet the workforce that maintained this elaborate system of invisibility was, by every account, among the best treated in England. The breadth of the Fifth Duke's building programme contradicts the popular caricature of him as a misanthropic ogre who spent his fortune burying himself alive. He was, in the assessment of many who worked for him, a demanding but generous employer who paid his workers reliably and provided for their families, and who simply could not bear to be seen by any of them. The construction workforce at Welbeck during the peak years of the underground works numbered in the hundreds, and some estimates place the total at over 1,000 men employed simultaneously during the most intensive periods of tunnelling and building. The Duke's insistence on employing local labour, paying competitive wages, and maintaining continuous work through seasons when other estates laid off their men made him one of the most significant employers in the district. His workers were paid reliably and on time at a time when many aristocratic employers defaulted on wages or paid late. And the continuity of employment he provided, year after year, decade after decade, through agricultural depressions and economic downturns that devastated the surrounding countryside, created a workforce that was skilled, loyal, and above all discreet. He erected approximately 50 estate lodges for his gardeners and keepers, all built in Steatley stone to a common design, all similarly planned and pleasing to the eye, each with a subterranean kitchen excavated beside it and lit by bull's-eye glass panels at ground level. To this he added a schoolhouse for the education of workers' children, almshouses for older retainers, and a roller skating rink built at the lakeside, which he encouraged his employees and their families to use freely. The breadth of these provisions paints a more nuanced portrait than the popular caricature allows. A man who could not bear to be seen, but who went to considerable trouble to ensure that the people who built his invisible world were well housed, well paid, and well looked after. His first major project upon inheriting in 1854, years before the tunnels and the underground ballroom consumed his attention, was to relocate and entirely rebuild the kitchen garden, constructing a new walled garden explicitly modelled on Prince Albert's royal kitchen garden at Frogmore in Windsor Home Park. The only difference was scale. Where the royal garden covered 17 acres, the Duke's at Welbeck extended to 22, making it the largest private kitchen garden in Britain, a distinction that suggests the 5th Duke, whatever his aversion to human contact, intended to feed his household with a generosity that bordered on the agricultural. Its walls, built with recesses at intervals where braziers could be placed for the ripening of fruit, ran for hundreds of metres in some directions, and an iron fruit arch, approximately 700 feet long, ran the length of one section, with apple trees trained along one side and pear trees along the other. The garden was designed to supply the estate with fruit, vegetables and flowers on a scale that reflected the ducal appetite for self-sufficiency. Everything consumed at Welbeck was to come from Welbeck, grown by Welbeck gardeners in Welbeck soil prepared in Welbeck kitchens and delivered through Welbeck tunnels to a door that the Duke opened himself. Below ground, the garden was threaded with an underground water collection and distribution system, gathering rainwater from the entire roof area of the walls for irrigation. The poultry house was a long stone building of fine architectural quality in which his chickens roamed a grass yard, enclosed by high iron railings and planted with fruit trees, with an ornamental fountain at the centre and stone bird stands on tall corner piers. This was the building from which his daily roast chickens were presumably sourced, and its design was executed with an attentiveness to ornamental detail that surpassed most farmyards in England. The same perfectionism applied to a chicken coop that had produced the largest private room in England and the second largest equestrian arena in the world. William John Cavendish Scott Bentinck, 5th Duke of Portland, died in 1879, and the estate passed to his cousin, who became the 6th Duke and promptly did what the 5th Duke had spent a lifetime avoiding. He filled Welbeck with people. The 6th Duke and his wife Winifred transformed the underground complex from a solitary's retreat into one of the great Edwardian entertainment venues, the hydraulic lift lowering guests in their carriages to the ballroom threshold, 400 seated for supper in the rooms the 5th Duke had labelled libraries and periodical rooms, the Prince of Wales a regular guest at events staged in chambers that had been built for absolute solitude. Underpinning the entire enterprise, tunnels, riding house, lodges, poultry house and gallop, was the private gas works the Duke had built around 1860, generating gas that was piped through miles of underground mains to power the lights in every corner of the estate. Without it, the underground corridors would have been entirely dark, and the great arena's thousands of jets silent. The gasworks continued operating until 1928, when the estate converted to electricity, and the industrial building that had powered the Duke's great invisible world stood largely unused for decades, its brick chimneys and cast-iron machinery slowly settling into the silence the Duke had always preferred. In 1990, restoration work began on the derelict structure. In 1994, the former gasworks was converted into the Harley Gallery, today one of the finest small art galleries in England. The original brick chimneys and industrial fabric were preserved as the frame for exhibitions of contemporary and historic art, and the gallery takes its name from the Harley family, whose marriage into the Cavendish line had first brought the Bentinck connection to Welbeck 3 centuries earlier. In a final pleasing symmetry, the building that had powered the Duke's great invisible world now illuminates a very public one. Its galleries open to anyone who wishes to walk in, the precise opposite of every principle the 5th Duke had lived by. The Ministry of Defence College that occupied Welbeck from 1953 to 2005 found a grimly practical use for the underground complex. The ballroom served as the students' gymnasium for over half a century. The room that had been conceived as a chapel, redesignated as a picture gallery, hung with Tintoretto and Van Dyck in gaslit silence, transformed into an Edwardian supper hall for 400 guests who descended by hydraulic lift, and finally reduced to a space where cadets did press-ups beneath the skylights the fifth Duke had installed to admit light he did not wish to share with anyone. The abbey itself remains in private hands, and the underground complex, conserved but largely inaccessible to the public, is one of the most extraordinary and least visible interior spaces in England. What makes the fifth Duke's story so difficult to categorise, and so resistant to the easy label of madness or eccentricity, is the quality of what he built. The engineering was impeccable, the materials were the finest available, the architectural design was executed with a seriousness and consistency that would have distinguished any patron of the Victorian era, and the sheer scale of the enterprise, 15 miles of tunnels, the largest private room in England, the second largest indoor equestrian arena in the world, placed him in the company of the great builder patrons of his century. He employed hundreds of men and women, paid them well and reliably, provided schools for their children and almshouses for their old age, built them 50 lodges with subterranean kitchens and a roller skating rink at the lakeside, and asked only one thing in return: that they never look at him. The request was strange, and the scale on which he enforced it was stranger still. But the quality of what he built with their labour has survived the man, the era, and the social world that produced him. The tunnels stretch for 15 miles beneath Sherwood Forest. The riding house still stands as the second largest of its kind in the world. The bullseye skylights still punctuate the lawn above the ballroom, and somewhere beneath the grass of Nottinghamshire, the gas pipes that once carried light to 7,500 jets in a single riding hall lie silent in the clay, connecting rooms that were built for a man who wanted nothing from the world except to be invisible in it.